one of my motivations for setting up this podcast was to think about how differently able people could access and take part in politics. That over the years you could count on one hand the number of parliamentarians there's been with an obvious disability, and there's been even fewer who have made it to the top of a British government. But today's guest has done both. David Blunkett has had a political career spanning now over 30 years and now continues to sit in the House of Lords. I'm really looking forward to talking to David Blunkett about some of the challenges that he must have faced in becoming a politician and hearing more about his extended career. So, welcome to People in Politics. David Blunkett, thank you so much for coming on the show, and it's really nice to meet you.
David, it's very good to be with you.
Thank you. And I've been really looking forward to talking to you, because one of the reasons that I set out this podcast was I was thinking about how people with disability get involved, take part in politics, and I suppose somewhat at my own frustration situation. And of course, you're one of very few people with a disability who's not just been a parliamentarian, but you've had a very long career in politics and made it right to the top of British government. So I've been really looking forward to talking to you about that and hearing how it's been.
Yeah, I think we're all affected by our history and background, our own personal experiences. Mine was of not being able to see from the get-go and the struggle to get educated and to find employment. I think people don't always know that others have been through the same struggle that they're experiencing. So my message is, don't give up, don't take no for an answer, keep going. You'll hit barriers and you've got to overcome them, I'm afraid. And sometimes that is extremely difficult. I mean, I was fortunate in the sense that I had family. I met teachers who were really helpful. So one teacher, for instance, came down to evening classes with me so I could start building up what were then O-levels, they're now called GCSEs. Had those kind of interventions and kindness not been present, I don't know whether I'd have had the confidence and the tenacity to do it. In terms of getting into politics, my mum was very ill, and my grandfather lived with us. My dad continued to work well into his 60s because of having me as a youngster. And unfortunately, he was killed in a works accident when I was 12. And that made a deep impression because although it was a publicly owned industry, the gas industry, at the time, they battled to stop my mother getting compensation because he'd reached retirement age. And I saw the struggle she had afterwards. And then my grandfather died in what can only be described as a workhouse. It was not a hospital or a residential home, it was a workhouse. And I just swore to myself I'd try and do something about it, that I'd try and make the world a better, more equal and a safer place. And so I joined the Labour Party 60 years ago.
Wow.
This last Easter, back in 1964. So it's been a long, long journey.
Wow, that's quite a long stint. to remember. I'm right in saying you went to a, a school for students who are blind. And was that difficult because the way you had to go away from home and stuff? So what was your childhood like?
The most difficult period was my primary schooling because it was a residential school for the blind. It happened to be at the opposite end of Sheffield, and in these days, a student would probably have been allocated a taxi to go and come back each day. That never existed then. So we all had to board, and we went home for a weekend mid-term and for the school holidays. And going to school, residential school at the age of 4 was, I mean, looking back, it was crazy. I think it was also quite damaging. I think it took me a long time to get over the emotional trauma of having not had my mum and my dad at the time around me. And although the youngsters who were house mothers who looked after us were very kind, they were learning on the job. Um, and schooling is always a challenge. And when I got to 12, because the change of schooling was 12 for blind children in those days, not 11, I was not put in to the grammar school. There was just one grammar school in those days for blind children in England, and they didn't put me in for that because they thought I was too disruptive and I wouldn't actually succeed, which said a lot about them. And so I went to a school that didn't do qualifications, academic qualifications. They did shorthand and typing, commercial qualifications, and they did piano tuning. And I don't disparage any of that. And I made a choice at 16 that I would do the commercial course because it enabled me to communicate, but that somehow I was going to try and get those academic qualifications. And a group of us, there were about 4 or 5 of us, went down to the local college in Shrewsbury. It was on the edge of Wales in county of Shropshire. And we went down every week for a year, and we took 2 qualifications in the first year, going 2 nights a week. And by some miracle, some of us passed. And that gave me the self-belief and the aspiration to carry on. It did take me 6 years to get to university. It was a learning curve. I'd rather not have spent 6 years having to do that, but it certainly stood me in very good stead later in life. And again, of course, it affected my political outlook.
Yeah, of course, it sounds like quite a struggle to get educated, and I suppose I'm going off at a tangent. It's a very similar story to my own story, a bit later, but like you, I eventually got into university, and uh, and so I think you must have decided quite early on that you wanted to do politics, because I think you went to study politics and more or less went straight into Sheffield City Council. Is that right?
Yes, I nearly did sociology, which was all the rage at the time in the late 60s. But I was offered a place at the University of Sheffield on what was a fairly new politics course. It involved political theory and institutions, and obviously history and philosophy as well. And after the first year, I got the opportunity to stand for Sheffield City Council because the person who was the councillor or the nominated candidate for Labour in the area in which I lived with my mum, because I was back in Sheffield by then, left. He had a job in South Wales, and by some miracle they chose me. I mean, a miracle, because nobody in their 20s in those days was likely to get political preferment. The youngest person on the council at that time was over 40. And of course, I couldn't see. So they took a big risk. So I was doing the political academic work and I was doing the elected work as a city council at the same time. It probably cost me getting a first. I mean, I got a 2-1. There weren't all that many firsts allocated in those days. And
That, that's still pretty good degree, a 2-1.
well, there was only one. There's a twist in this story because all these years later, I'm in the House of Lords, and so is Philip Norton, who is a Conservative peer, who's a professor of politics at Hull.
Wow.
And he was the only student in my year at the University of Sheffield who got a first in politics. And he spent all his time in the library. And I spent too much of my time on the council and marching against apartheid. And we have a laugh about that quite often. And on many issues, we actually do see eye to eye. So all these years on, I'm in a sense working alongside him.
Yeah, that's a good story. And so going a bit further on in 1987, yeah, you got elected to Parliament. So what were your early days as a parliamentarian like at that time?
I think I think I'd had a very good experience as being leader of the city for 7 years from 1980. Difficult years. Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. Local government was massively under the cosh as it is today. All kinds of things had happened around the miners' strike. We had the miners' headquarters in Sheffield. The anti-nuclear war film Threads was made in 1984, 40 years ago, in Sheffield. All kinds of things happening at the same time. But I knew that if I was going to really make a difference, I would have to get into Parliament, much as I loved what I was able to do in local government, and quite a lot was done in those years. I got the chance to stand for the seat in which I'd been brought up, and that was a great privilege. And I knew the area well, and I'd served on the council from that area. And I found Parliament challenging. Firstly, the difficulty of persuading them that I could only work on equal terms if I had extra help, i.e.,
Yeah.
extra staff to read, to sift, and equipment to be able to do the job. That took quite a struggle. I got it in the end, but it took 9 months to get things in place, and I had to just survive while I was doing that. Secondly, although I knew something about Parliament and the parliamentary system, not just because I'd studied it, but because I'd been a member of the Labour Party's national executive for 4 years at that point, and I'd met a lot of people, I still found it a very strange environment. It was still very much a gentleman's, and I mean gentleman's club, very much steeped in the past. And although there'd been many radical politicians, Labour and Liberal, actually the system had not changed all that much. And I found that difficult. I also found it difficult because the one thing that's always been the challenge, the big challenge, was getting sufficient time to read documents and material.
Yeah.
And that meant, it was my quid pro quo. It meant I had to put the hours in. As a consequence, two things happened. Firstly, I didn't make immediately a good impression because I wasn't socializing in the bars and the tea rooms. And I was also slightly bumptious because I had been the leader of a major council and a member of the national executive, and I did think I knew it all. And that didn't go down well. But secondly, my marriage was breaking up, so my social life was falling apart. So it was a difficult transition. I was helped by, again, by people who did come forward and were supportive, and I was helped by Neil Kinnock, who was the leader of the Labour Party at that time, giving me a minor, at the time, front bench job in what was effectively the environment and local government portfolio. And I made something of it. It was at the time when the government had decided to experiment with the poll tax in Scotland,
Oh, yeah.
creating Scotland as a kind of guinea pig, and which cost the Conservatives for the following 30 odd years, and because they were going to introduce it in Britain, so there was a bill going through, and I just grasped the opportunity and became, if you like, the local government spokesman, the voice of the Labour Party on local government in Parliament and outside on the campaigning trail. So I just grabbed the opportunity. It was a two-edged sword, because it was a very difficult sell, because we were saying to people, look, to keep the services going, you're going to have to pay this wretched tax, but we're going to do away with it when we eventually get into government. As it happened, we managed to do away with it the moment Margaret Thatcher fell from office, because the Tories were scared stiff that they'd lose the 92 election on the back of it. So in one sense, the campaign worked, but it was a two-edged sword. But I grabbed that, and that was the beginning of making a parliamentary impact and making a much bigger public impact. And John Smith, when he became leader after 1992, giving me a shadow cabinet place as shadow health secretary. So that was how the slow climb up the greasy pole really began.
Yeah, it sounds like it must have been really hard work, and I'm sure you had to really work hard to get the help that you needed, and no, it must have been exhausting, because I think non-disabled people don't appreciate the energy and the just the extra effort it is, just to tread the water and to get the help that you need, and you must have had that right through your education and your days at Sheffield.
Yeah, and I'm not sort of parading it as any big I am. I'm saying it because other people need to know
Yeah,
that their struggle was my struggle, your struggle, David. That what they're going through isn't unique to them, and that they should keep going. And it won't be easy, but you do what is best in the circumstances for you in the area where you have a real interest, and people will, because they're individuals, not a lumpen group. They'll have different interests and different possibilities.
yeah, sure, yeah. Um, as we're talking about the help that you got, and I was gonna come on to ask you, because when you were Home Secretary and Education Secretary, I was gonna ask you, how did that all work? Did you have did you just have lots and lots of people reading to you, and you must have just had to absorb so much information by ear, and I can't imagine how that would have been.
Yeah, well, sometimes, David, I can't imagine how I did it either. I was working at the very outer reaches of what I thought was possible. A lot of help around me at that time, of course. If you're in the cabinet, you get a lot of help because you're
Yeah,
in the department and support. It also means there's lots of people producing material for you, so you get quite a lot of stuff down the line. I'd learned a lesson from Michael Heseltine, former deputy leader of the Conservatives, who has very severe dyslexia, and he'd got people to come around the table and discuss what otherwise they'd have put in a lengthy paper. So I did a bit of that as well. And I also said, if you keep on writing these incredible tomes, I'm going to make you read them to me. So that cut down the volume a little bit. And I said, yeah, of course I want the evidence, and of course I want the alternative recommendations, but I want them in a form that's clear enough to be able to absorb. And if I want more, I'll come back for more and I'll ask for more. And so I also learned the art of delegation, so that I built a team around me, both of special advisors and of good ministers, and if you trusted your ministers and they reported back regularly, you could delegate whilst giving guidance and support to them. And I thought that was a much better way than trying to do it all myself.
What else that he had um, the it must have worked well because Fraser Nelson of the Spectator wrote at the time that you were never underbriefed. And so our system must have worked pretty well.
Well, he was very kind. I probably overdid it, again to the detriment of having the work-life balance. What I never wanted was to be in a meeting and for other people to think he's not really read this, has he? He really is not on top of the facts here. And actually, I discovered after a while, David, that people were reading their briefs during the meeting. So I was better briefed because I'd had to do the homework before. There was no choice, so I just did it. And as I say, I'm sometimes think I probably overdid it a bit, but it did stand me in good stead because at least I had the facts at my fingertips and the arguments and could make a good fist of it, even if I didn't always win.
I know, but you never do it in politics. And I was gonna ask you when you got into the bench or front bench in particular, often when the same people do something, there's an expectation that they're doing it to campaign for disability or with a fight for disability. So as well as looking after your constituents, was there an expectation that you were somehow going to be this flag bearer for disability or anything?
Well, in education, I passed a piece of legislation, I led on a piece of legislation which is little known about, which encouraged and supported schools in integrating pupils with disabilities, not against specialist schools, because sometimes that is necessary, particularly with massive increase in multiple handicap, because obviously babies are being saved who would otherwise have died, and disabilities that are new forms of disability are emerging. So I wasn't against, but I wanted to provide equality of opportunity. So we did that while I was Education and Employment Secretary. I also had the broader disability equality brief, and I led on introducing the Disability Rights Commission in the UK, which in 2010 was morphed into the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. I'm not sure whether that was a good move, by the way. I'd long left the government by then, and there was a fetish for combining what was the equal opportunities, the race relations,
Yeah.
equality issues, and disability together. But the DRC, which was led by someone who was a wheelchair user, actually did in its time make a real difference. What I said to the world was, I'm going to support and I'm going to use my experience where it's appropriate, but I'm going to designate a member of my team as the Minister for Disability Issues, because if I do it, I will become the disability minister, and that's how I'll be seen. And I want to show the world that someone with a disability can do the wider brief as well as supporting disability rights. And I want to get across to parliamentarians and councillors that it's their job and not just mine to actually campaign for and to promote the rights of people with disabilities. And we're still struggling with that, aren't we?
We're making steps forward sometimes, but it's slow progress.
Yeah.
And then you actually covered one of the questions that I was going to ask you, because I couldn't remember if it was the Labour Party that set out the DRC, and of course, as you know, disabled people campaigned for decades to have a commission set up.
Yeah.
and it was established for a few years. And
Yeah.
I wonder if you thought it was a good thing or bad thing that it was more authority because my concern is that when they were all amalgamated to one, my concern was that disability would just fall right back down to the bottom for the.
Yeah, there had been a predecessor act. Well, there'd been two way back in the 1970. There'd been the act that was promoted by Alf Morris that became a kind of totem for what might be done in the future. And then, after enormous campaigning within and outside Parliament, there was the Disability Discrimination Act introduced by the Conservatives in 1996. It cost one minister his health and his parliamentary career. In the end, it was introduced, and I had the privilege of updating it for the first time with a strengthening amendment when I was at Education and Employment, alongside setting up the DRC. And then, of course, it was strengthened still further a year or two later. So there's been various iterations of the DDA, gradually building it up. And I think there's still room to go. As you say, we've made progress, and it's been slow, but we've still got a way to go. And in particular, interpreting how the Act is seen. People are still being denied taxi journeys or entry to restaurants if they have a guide dog. I mean, there are all kinds of other things happening to people with motor difficulties or deafness that I'm not as familiar with as I am with loss of sight. But there's still a struggle, and it's about changing the culture, and it's particularly about getting people with all forms of disability the right to progress into work. And I say progress into work because it's about getting skilled. It's about being given the chance, and apprenticeships is one of those chances. It's the right to have an interview if you have the right background and professional skills. And it's the right to have adaptations properly. And the Access to Work scheme, which I've championed, is very good, but it's still clumsy, it's still bureaucratic, and it's still not sufficiently resourced. And it's an absolute lifeline, because people can say to an employer that there will be resource available to make these adaptations.
Yeah.
And please give me a chance to show what I can do.
Sure. I think from our email correspondence, you put a member that employment has been a big bugbear for me, and I've found it very frustrating and challenging to try and get work over the years. And I was glad that before the DDA there was the old green card system, and I was wondering if you thought that was better, because the green card system seems to be more measurable and enforceable, and I wonder what you thought about that.
Well, I mentioned the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act that Alf Morris pioneered, and part of that was that there should be a 3% marker for employers. It didn't work, actually. I mean, people were designated as having a disability in order to meet the 3%, or the 3% was just ignored altogether. So I'm not sure that the predecessor system worked all that well. However, it has to be said that in certain jobs, there was greater availability of the chance of employment. And technology has been both a liberator for people with disability. It's made things possible, including working from home, but it's also provided major challenges by eliminating forms of employment. For instance, telephony used to be an opportunity for people with all sorts of disabilities for employment, and that the technology's taken that over now.
Yeah, who does?
Please press button 1 for this, 2 for that.
So our job's gone. Yeah. So, the other thing you mentioned is, I think that this is really terrific as you really improved integration in education, because back in the 1980s, I went to a special education school, which nowadays I think people would just think was ridiculous given my very slight disability, and so I think that it's all better. But like you say, we need special schools for some sort of for some students and not others.
Yeah.
Um,
And sometimes, David, for a period of time, rather than it being for the whole of the schooling experience, because at the end of the schooling experience, you have to come out into the world as it is.
yeah, yeah, because if you go to a special school, you come back out into the world, and it's very different indeed. And students need to be prepared for that. I was going to ask you if you thought politics is becoming more accessible to different people groups, because there's still a tiny, tiny amount of disabled people who get involved in politics.
I think that technology has helped, but it's also a different kind of political arena. I made my name because I was good at speaking.
Yeah.
I could do oratory,
Yeah.
and that's no longer the case. People now are obviously using, as we are doing now, podcasts. They're using YouTube and blogs. They're in a different ball game, and I'm not sure, if I'm honest, that this is as easy for people with a variety of disabilities as the old-fashioned being out there and being seen, and the way in which people made their decisions. Even if you have challenges in relation to communication, people at public meetings would be understanding. It's very hard to get over that if you've got to do a sound bite. And
Yeah.
these days, it's very much sound bites.
Uh, the world seems to be, the world goes around by really short sound bites. And I was telling Jam some of the internet that our attention spans, must be going really,
Yeah,
be, be eroded, because everything's about 30 seconds sound bites. And I think that's what prevents all people, particularly about myself, from being in politics, because you generally have to be a really good orator, and I think that's the
yeah. And people pay lip service to equality, but actually, in practice, they often shy away. They won't even recognize it in their own head that they're doing so, but they do. I still find this, and I've been around all these years. It's now what just having to do the calculation. We're coming up to 37 years since I entered
oh
the
dear.
House of Commons,
That's,
and I still feel that people don't get it. I still feel that they'd be very nice about it, but sometimes it verges on the patronizing.
uh, still, after all this time, I think it's funny that yeah, you've been home secretary, and people can still patronize.
They
Um,
don't think they're doing it, David. They really don't. And there's a very fine line between kindness and being patronizing.
yeah.
I'm fully in favor of kindness.
Yeah, exactly. So, and have a, finding or enjoying house the House of Lords.
Total contradiction. It can be infuriating because uh, its its ability to move into the 21st century is snail space. And some of the arcane ways in which we operate drive me crackers. But there is good space for debate and to air issues that otherwise wouldn't be aired. We have the opportunity of asking the Commons to think again, although they rarely do.
So,
We have the opportunity to highlight, particularly over the Brexit issue and more recently over Rwanda and whether it was a safe country, the issues that have been pushed through the House of Commons very quickly. And because of the toing and froing, the ping pong as it's known, between the two houses, it's got attention, and therefore the issue has got attention. So whilst in the end, the elected House obviously must get its way and does, the upper house can actually highlight and make the issue salient. And I think that's worthwhile. I wouldn't be in the place, and I will step down when I think I can't make a meaningful contribution. Sometimes we get agreement behind the scenes, by the way. Sometimes issues are raised as legislation's going through committee or an issue's been raised publicly where there is agreement behind, if you like, behind the chair, where people come to an understanding that this is an issue that is not about ideological values and we can reach agreement. And there's quite a lot unseen that happens there where the government itself then make the adjustments.
yeah, it sounds interesting, and it sounds quite vital because people have said that the Lords does, affect the government, although the government always get their way.
Mm.
The Lords does affect, and I'm very conscious of the ping pong, as you said, particularly recently over the Rwanda
Yeah.
bill trying to legislate to 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 make it a safe country with put that as a lot. So it must be interesting. But
And I think people got the message much more than they ever would have done had the Lords not been there to make the space, to make the time, to have the expertise, because we have ex-high Supreme Court judges. Some of them have been Supreme Court president. We have expert barristers, as well as those experienced in other walks of life and in politics. And that came into play so that people are highlighting things that I think the advisors to the government themselves had not thought of.
yeah, that's good. And as you mentioned Rwanda, it made me think of something that you're a big advocate of ID cards. And I wonder, do you still think ID cards would have prevented the issue that they're talking about right now?
It would have been a contribution, not a solution, but a contribution to stopping the organised traffickers being able to say, well, look, if you are threatened with Rwanda, we'll get you a job, we'll get you a bed, disappear into the ether. And there's no way of monitoring that at all at the moment. And ironically, the only way in which the government will be able to implement another piece of legislation, which has caused controversy recently, which is in the House of Commons and will come to the Lords, which is the ban on the purchase of tobacco for anyone born after 2008. Because how on earth do you enforce that? How do you recognize the identity of someone seeking to purchase cigarettes or tobacco? Never mind their age, if there's no identification available. So actually, I think in a number of fields, a light touch form of ID, sometimes you would hold it on your smartphone if you have one, sometimes you'd carry suitable biometric card, all based on the information that you give for your passport. My mistake was to be in a rush. I should have simply said we'll issue everyone over 16 who hasn't got a passport with a passport, and when everyone renews, they will automatically go on the system and they'll get a card or these days an electronic version to go with it. And gradually that would have brought in a system which would now have been up and running, whereas by 2010 we'd only made marginal progress on it. I had one and I used it in traveling to France and Poland, but the coalition government were committed to doing away with it, which is what they did.
So it's gonna a very good, it's gonna be an interesting year, and I hope they call the election sooner rather than later.
It is going to be a very interesting year, and I don't think that the election's in the bag for the Labour Party at all. There's a terrible old expression which is the party's not over until the fat lady's sung, and in this case the fat lady is the electorate, and I'm cautioning about the idea that these opinion polls are accurate or that there will be an avalanche. I pray obviously that Labour will have an overall majority, but it's by no means a foregone conclusion.
No, I completely agree with you, and I think a lot of people are talking like it's in the bag for Labour, but you know, I've read a lot of things recently that said that it's a totally different scenario from 1997 when Tony and Blair came in. So I don't think it's in the bag for Labour. Yeah, people are not in love with Keir Starmer. Far from
Well,
it.
it's certainly a different political environment. I think people are absolutely fed up with the government and what's happened over the last few years, 3 prime ministers in 2 years and multiple ministers in every possible office. The most bizarre is that in the UK terms, as opposed to the devolved parliaments and assembly, we've had 16 housing ministers in 14 years. No wonder the housing situation is chronic. Is there anything else that you wanted to explore with me? I know that those who are signing up to your podcast will be familiar with your challenges. Is there anything that you wanted to get across or further to ask me?
Well, I was about to wind up the podcast, so if we stop the podcast now, then maybe I can ask you things once.
Okay. Well, I'd just like to say what a great pleasure it's been, and I wish you well, and I hope that as many people as possible will sign up and will get some encouragement and I hope a little bit of backing from our discussion.
Thank you very much, David. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time. I'm really grateful.